Welcome to the Schedule Reaction Show presented by Ticketmaster. Casey Phillips here with senior writer and editor Scott Smith, and the schedule just dropped. We love this day of the year. We get to find out what our lives are going to look like for months on end in the fall.
To react.
The Bucs fans are excited. I hope you guys are figuring out which trips you're going to do to go see the different games. So we figured out we're going to share all of our reactions, but we thought you'd enjoy hearing some of the reactions from the players when they saw the schedule for the first time.
I mean, you know, it's football.
Week 5.
We respect everybody.
Week 1 in Minnesota, we'll go homecoming.
Man, I don't care who we play.
Okay, we got a little song, we got a little work.
What about the bye week? A little early.
Ooh!
Wait a minute.
That's how it gotta be, you know. We gotta shock the world, you know. It's okay. There's gonna be some times they try to get us like, hey, play this time. It's all right.
2 prime times, huh? Ooh. Yeah, this interesting schedule right here. You got to bring it every game. I love it.
I loved their reactions to a few different things on there, but most of all, of course, I love that they all say, doesn't matter what the schedule is, we're going in to do work.
Yeah.
Which is always fun. But there were a couple themes you saw that they picked up on in there. Noticed one in particular, the bye week. What have we noticed about that?
Well, it's in week 5, and that's the earliest bye week the Bucs have had since 2017. And you really can't know until you get into the season what would end up being the best week, because you could have a lot of injuries early on, or you could be more banged up later in the season. But generally, later byes are considered more favorable because there's more likelihood that guys will be banged up by then. So not ideal, but it really, in the end, is probably not going to matter that much.
Yep, and some of the other maybe big themes that stood out to you, what might a couple of those be?
Well, there's 12 1 o'clock games there, and you know that's what happens when you move on from the GOAT, right? And one of the games hasn't been scheduled yet in week 18, so there could be another one. But there's a lot to really like here. I personally think Philly coming here in week 3 on Monday night is a very exciting game, and it also gives me deja vu from 2018, the last time Philly was in the Super Bowl. They came here in week 2, and the Bucs beat them 27-21. So now they're coming in week 3, hopefully a similar outcome. There's a few other things. I think right away, the Bucs defense better start working on stopping running quarterbacks, because they're going to face a lot of them. They got Chicago and Justin Fields in week 2, Jalen Hurts in week 3. They got Josh Allen in Buffalo in week 8, and possibly Anthony Richardson, the rookie, will be playing for Indianapolis, and he's a really good runner. He's a Cam Newton type powerful runner.
And I know that whenever the schedule comes out, we always take a look at home and away games of when they come. Are there a bunch stacked in a row of one kind or the other? What did you notice about that breakdown?
There's one really, you don't see it when you first look at the schedule, and then you start counting it up. There's one really kind of unusual stretch from week 8 to 15 where over an 8-week span the Bucs are on the road 6 times. Now it evens out because that means they've got some other times when they're getting a couple home games in a row, but never more than 2 home games in a row or 2 road games in a row. But week 6 or week 8 to week 15, 6 road trips.
So those were some of our big picture thoughts looking at the schedule overall, but we definitely want to take a deep dive week by week. So let's start with week 1 on the road at Minnesota. What are some of the things that stand out to you about that game?
Well, the Vikings have really had a pretty good passing attack for some years now, even though Kirk Cousins seems to get a lot of bad press. But for instance, last year they were 6th in the league in passing, and they do have maybe the single best receiver in the game right now in Justin Jefferson. But he's going to have a new running mate this year because Adam Thielen is now in Carolina, and the Vikings drafted USC's Jordan Addison in the 1st round, and he does a lot of things well. He's a very good route runner, good with the ball in his hands after the catch, and so he'll probably step right in there and be the number 2 option for Kirk Cousins there in their passing game.
And I'm guessing that Mike Evans and Chris Godwin may want to show out a little bit that game. You know, hey, maybe we might be one of the better duos in the league. The
Bucs might have the better duo on the field that day, and they're going to be going up against a Vikings defense that has kind of sneakily been bad for about 3 years now, even though they've drafted a ton of cornerbacks in the early rounds in recent years. So they just went and did it again. They picked Mekhi Blackman and Jay Ward in the 3rd round, and they signed Byron Murphy from Arizona. So they're trying to fix that pass defense. But week 1, Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, Russell Gage, that's a tough early test for those guys, especially the rookies, so welcome to the NFL.
Yeah, but of course it's not like they only have a passing attack. that the defensive line is going to have a thing or two to do for the Bucs as well? Right.
So the Bucs will have a kind of a new look defensive front since they drafted Kalijah Kancey, and that's going to change Logan Hall's role a little bit, and they'll be playing outside of Vita Vea, and they're expecting the run defense to get back to the heights that it had for most of the time that Todd Bowles has been here, but they're going to have to face Dalvin Cook. There's been some trade or release rumors about Dalvin Cook, but he's still one of the NFL's better running backs, and even if he's not in the game, they have Alexander Madison, who, as fantasy football players know, every time Dalvin Cook is out, Madison just kind of steps in and does the same thing.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, so now let's head over to week 2 here, taking on the Chicago Bears. That will be the Bucs home opener, which is always a very fun game. And I think this is going to be an interesting team to have it for. I know earlier in the show you talked about the idea of how many running quarterbacks the team would be facing, and here's one of them pretty quick off the bat.
Maybe the scariest one of them all. I mean, that's strange to say when you're also going to be talking about Jalen Hurts, but Justin Fields of the Bears ran for 1,143 yards as a quarterback last year. That's the second most ever in a single season by a quarterback. So that is definitely something the Bucs are going to need to get figured out. But fortunately, since he's been here, Todd Bowles' defense have usually figured out running quarterbacks pretty well.
And I know the Bears also, in addition to some young quarterbacks, they have some young corners as well, which we talked about. This tall order for that team against the likes of Mike Evans, Chris Godwin.
It's a little bit of an early season theme there because the Bears, really, they've been kind of reconstructing their whole roster for about a year now. But in the draft, they picked last year they picked Kyler Gordon and Jaquan Brisker in the second round. That's a couple guys that are starting for them now. And then this year in the second round, they picked Miami's cornerback Tyreek Stevenson in the second round. So that's a lot of really young guys to be playing all at once, but they are sort of remaking that whole defense.
And I know that, them trying to protect their quarterback is going to be very important for them. He is a big part of their team. And do you feel like they're going to be up to that task? What is it going to look like for the Bucs trying to get pressure on a guy like him who is so mobile?
Well, they clearly put a priority on that because they used their first-round pick on Tennessee's Darnell Wright, which coincidentally was a guy that a lot of people were mock drafting to the Buccaneers. But the Bears really wanted to improve that protection for Justin Fields, get the running game going. They also signed Nate Davis in free agency, and their left tackle was a fifth-round pick last year, Braxton Jones, but he did really well. So I think they're going to bank on him continuing to play well there and put Darnell Wright on the right side.
Okay, so now let's go ahead and move on to week 3. I know this is a game that you already talked about the excitement for this one. It is going to be the Monday night game versus the Philadelphia Eagles. Man, what an exciting matchup, early on in the season, coming off this team that's been doing so well. And you already talked about Jalen Hurts. I mean, again, just already boom, boom, back-to-back weeks, these mobile quarterbacks.
Yeah, in 2021, when he was really just starting to get going, the Eagles came here for the playoffs. Remember that game? And like I said, Todd Bowles' defense have done well against guys like that, and they really shut Jalen Hurts and that defense down for most of the day. Since then, he's gotten just better and better and better to the point that last year he was second in the MVP voting, only to Patrick Mahomes, and he accounted for 35 total touchdowns through the air and his running, 13 touchdowns rushing.
Yeah, that's incredible. And I feel like this is our first chance also to talk a little bit about the Bucs O-line in a matchup, and that's a group that we're all going to be watching a lot this offseason.
Well, I guess this is why Philadelphia was in the Super Bowl, right? Because in addition to that Jalen Hurts offense, they had a defense that led the league with 70 sacks, 15 more than any other team in the entire league. And then they drafted Jalen Carter out of Georgia to have like 7 different Georgia defenders on their team now. So they still obviously have a lot of those defenders that you've heard about for a long time there, Brandon Graham, Fletcher Cox, and then the one they got last year, Hassan Reddick, he ended up with 16 sacks. So they're going to be coming at you from all angles, and the Bucs offensive line is going to be a bit reconstructed, probably Tristan Wirfs on the left side. So it's going to, like we keep saying early test, but that's kind of the theme here.
Yeah, and I know you said this game gives you a little bit of deja vu. Tell everybody a little bit of why.
Okay, so in 2017, at the end of that season, the Eagles beat the Patriots in the Super Bowl, and the following season then obviously they're the defending champions, and they came here in week 2, and the Bucs with that was the Fitzmagic game where he put on Deshaun Jackson's and stuff after the game. Bucs beat the Eagles 27-21 for a real good start to that season that didn't quite hold, but it started out really good. So now, coming off another Super Bowl for the Eagles, here they are again in September in Tampa, and this time it's on a primetime stage.
It's going to be exciting. And now we decided we're going to talk about the division games together. So we're going to talk about our 2 games against the New Orleans Saints. The first one is at the Saints in week 4. The second one is at home in week 17. Always love those late season division games that it could come down to that is always so important. So I mean, man, this NFC South, the Bucs have had it lately, and now it's a division that feels very up in the air. A lot of changes on all teams. Where do you feel like these 2 games could stand in terms of deciding who's taking it?
Yeah, so it took a while for the Bucs to wrest control of this division away from the Saints, who won it every year from 2017 to 2020. But the turning point was the Bucs beating the Saints in New Orleans in the playoffs after 2020, and then they went on to win the next 2 divisions. But every team in the division last year was either 8-9 or 7-10. So the Buccaneers only had a 1-game lead on all these teams its supremacy for this division is clearly up for grabs. And like you said, that second game, Week 17, our last home game in the regular season, you never know, that could be deciding the division.
And a big part of this division is how many new quarterbacks there are. I mean, it was just the quarterback shuffle this last year with these teams. And what do you feel like is going to be the thing that stands out to you most in terms of specifically now seeing the Saints and the Bucs with both teams having a new quarterback at the helm?
The funny thing is that the Saints all of a sudden now have the most experienced quarterback in the league with Derek Carr, who they signed to a big contract after the Raiders let him go. And whatever you think of Derek Carr, he's put up some pretty good numbers in his career. He's been to 3 Pro Bowls. He has a 91.8 career passer rating, and he does sometimes throw a few too many interceptions. He had 14 interceptions in each season, each of the last 2 seasons. So.
Well, and that's usually a stat that is a big indicator, particularly it feels like in this matchup against the Saints.
Oh, for sure. Turnovers. For 4 or 5 years now, turnovers have been the story. Whoever wins the turnover battle, in fact, whichever team won the turnover battle in the last 10 games, including the postseason, between these two teams, 8 of the 10 won the game. So, and the coach talks about it before. Every time we play the Saints, it's all going to come down to that. And last year, the Buccaneers only had 20 takeaways for the entire season, which was the fewest that they've had in any season since Todd Bowles got here.
So again, as we move down through the schedule, that was week 4 and 17 against the Saints. But after week 4, week 5, this is the one that elicited the reaction from the players. the early bye on week 5. Tell me your thoughts on this. I mean, we talked about it a little bit earlier in the show, but boy, that's an early week.
Yeah, but don't make your mind up right now, because in week 4, a couple guys could be banged up and unavailable for a week, and an extra week rest helps you out just then.
Yep.
You never know when it's going to be,
know.
So don't worry about it. It's probably not going to be the reason the season goes one way or another.
Very true. So then coming out of the bye, the Bucs are facing the Detroit Lions, a very fun storyline and team recent years. So tell me, what do you feel like this Lions offense could look like after, another year under their belt of trying to get, Jared Goff figured out and what that offense could look like? What do you think the Bucs defense will be facing?
Well, I don't know if you knew this, but the Lions actually were 5th in the league in points scored last year. They weren't just a fun story. They were getting it done, and they have figured out Jared Goff. And now they use 2 high draft picks on Alabama running back Jahmyr Gibbs and Iowa tight end Sam Laporta. Gibbs joins, and they also signed David Montgomery, the former Bear. So they've really kind of redone their backfield. They traded DeAndre Swift away, and I think they've got weapons coming at you from every angle. You talk about the Amon-Ra St. Brown, and now they've got the big tight end and the big running back, so it should be a pretty potent offense.
Yeah, and their offense was their strong point last year, not quite so much on the defensive side of things.
Yeah, all that scoring they did, and I think they outscored their opponents by like 15 total points, because they gave up a lot of points, 392.4 per game, or yards per game, 25.1 points per game. Those yardage totals were last in the league. They did draft Jack Campbell in the first round, the Iowa linebacker, and they did draft Alabama safety Brian Branch, so those guys should help right away. And then also they tried to make their secondary a little stronger in free agency with cornerbacks Cam Sutton and Emmanuel Mosley and safety C.J. Gardner-Johnson. So they've thrown a lot of resources at that side, but who knows how quickly it's going to come together.
And then looking at Jared Goff, as we've talked about, the way that they've been able to use him, turnovers is a thing that we know, again, is going to be such a point of emphasis for this Bucs defense this year. It was hard to come by last year. Is this a game where you see them maybe being able to force a few more?
It'd be nice to force Jared Goff into some mistakes, but it's not going to be easy against an offensive line that many consider one of the best in the league. They have Taylor Decker and Penny Sewell on the edges. Those are 2 really good players. Their center, Frank Ragnow, is a great player, and they were 2nd in sacks allowed, the lowest sacks allowed rate last year. But Jared Goff did throw 29 interceptions in his last 2 years with the Rams. The Lions seems to have figured that out. He's only thrown 15 over his 2 seasons with them, so we'll see.
And then now we're going to move on to week 7 against the Atlanta Falcons, and then also week 14 against the Atlanta Falcons, putting these 2 together here. I'm excited for this draft pick to watch. Bijan Robinson's a guy we talked about really enjoying, during the draft process, and knowing that it was unlikely he'd be there for the Bucs at 19, and unfortunately had to go to the dang division rival. So what do you think about this guy and what he could bring to the Falcons?
Well, for one thing, the Buccaneers run stoppers better put on their big boy pants for this game, because the Falcons run the ball more than any team in the league. They actually were 2nd in terms of the percentage of plays that were runs, but that's because the Bears were 1st because their quarterback ran all the time. The Falcons aren't running their quarterback, but they are running in all situations, in all quarters, went up by 10, went down by 10, and now they had Tyler Algier across 1,000 yards last year. They have Cordero Patterson who can do everything, and now you add in what is considered the best running back prospect since Saquon Barkley in Bijan Robinson. they are going to run the ball a lot. We better be ready for that.
Yeah, that's very true. And then how about the matchup with the Bucs wide receivers and the Falcons corners? How do you see that playing out?
Well, they've tried a little bit to increase that defense, but in the last couple of years. But actually, I think the more interesting matchup is the Bucs corners against their pass catchers, because they have really gotten big players. They like Arthur Smith came from Tennessee, where they like him big players at every position. They have Drake London, who's huge, and they have Kyle Pitts, the tight end, who's huge. And it's going to be a test for our corners trying to stop those big pass catchers.
Yeah, and then how about the Bucs? This is another chance to get a chance. We want to talk about the Bucs O-line as well. I just think this is such an interesting storyline, and the way that different teams are going to challenge them by matchups, whether it's against their defensive line or against certain backs and everything. So what do you feel like is going to be the big test for the Bucs O-line in this game?
Well, the Falcons have been trying for years now to get some kind of pass rush, and nothing has worked. They've basically been the worst pass rushing team in the league for 3 or 4 years now. So this time they just went out and got a whole bunch of veterans. They got Calais Campbell, they got Bud Dupree, and they got David Onyemata from division rival Saints. So they've really tried to reload their front with a lot of proven pass rushers and run stoppers. So if that works out for them, a lot of free agent veteran additions don't always work out, but if this works out for the Falcons, they'll be a much harder test for the Bucs offensive line than usual.
Okay, how about we move on to Week 8 at the Buffalo Bills.
I'm excited about that one.
Fun matchup this is going to be. So Von Miller, kind of a big factor there. What do you think we're going to see? What Von Miller could we be seeing?
So when Von Miller was traded from Denver to the Rams, he was a huge factor in them winning the Super Bowl that year, especially in the playoffs, and kind of pretty much ended the Super Bowl for the Rams. And so when the Bills signed him, it's a little bit out of character for them. They usually don't spend big money on outside free agents, but they felt like this was the final piece of their defense. Unfortunately for them, he injured a knee along the way and missed like the last 6 games of the season. But in the 11 games that he played, he did have 8 sacks. So they have also invested in Greg Rousseau and A.J. Epinesa high in the draft in recent years, put those guys together with Von Miller for a full 17-game season, and they're probably going to rush the passer very well.
And then, man, Josh Allen, one of the most fun people to watch, but every time I find myself being terrified for him, that he is just, I know he's big and I know he's fast, but he is just throwing his body around out there. Do you think
I think he loves it.
I definitely think he loves it, but do you think this is the year that the Bills are like, man, maybe we need to rein this in a bit, or you know what, this works really well, we're going to keep doing it?
Since they've had so much success with it, I just can't see them getting away from it. And honestly, I don't think they can make Josh Allen stop doing stuff like we're watching here on the screen right now. And so you don't normally run into this. Even when you're talking about defending a running quarterback, it's usually because like Lamar Jackson, they're just so hard to catch. But this guy will initiate contact and try to run through you. So yeah, that's a different sort of challenge for the Bucs defenders.
And I know they've added their tight end Dalton Kincaid, and one of the storylines we've talked about on the Bucs side of things is who's the nickel this year. They've said they want to move Antoine Winfield back to more of the safety role, and this is one of those situations where that is an important position in this game. What do you see for that? So
Dalton Kincaid was probably the best downfield pass catcher, seam stretcher tight end available, the most dynamic of all the really good tight ends this year that were available. And the Bills got him because they really kind of need a primary number 2 option after Stephon Diggs. They really haven't found one that's been as productive as they would like. He could be the guy, which means there's going to be a lot of times when he's split out wide and not in line, like he's in the slot. So even if you're a slot corner, you might end up covering a tight end a lot. And so, yeah, the Buccaneers have to figure out who their slot is. One of the guys that's going to get an early shot at it is 6th-round draft pick Josh Hayes. So that's going to be a tough test for him if he does win that job. Yes, it is. All right, next up here, we have Week 9 at the Houston Texans, and boy, did they have some fun in the draft this year. So first of all, of course, let's talk about their new quarterback. Do you see this be one of the earlier games he's in? Do you think he's in Week 1? How much experience, is he playing? How much experience will he have had by this Week 9 matchup? I think the Texans will probably say all the way up to the season that they don't have to start him Week 1. There's no timetable. The Panthers are already saying that about Bryce Young, but pretty much every guy that's taken first overall in the last 10 years has started Week 1. Baker Mayfield started Week 3, I think. So they get in there right away because that's your future, and that's also the guy you just invested heavily in. I fully expect C.J. Stroud to be starting by then, in part because he was such a polished passer. I mean, he's ready for the NFL right now. He's a really talented guy, and I think we'll see him for sure. One guy we have not talked a whole lot about yet, which is a travesty, is Rachaad White. I am very excited to see what he's able to do this year, and I feel like this is one of the games where
theoretically, if things go at all similar to last year, maybe he has a chance to pop off a little bit.
Yeah, if you're excited about watching Rachaad White, he's probably excited about playing this game because the Texans had the worst run defense in the NFL last year. They gave up, it was a lot, 170.2 points or yards per game and 5.1 yards per carry. They did add Sheldon Rankins. I'm not sure how much that moves the needle, but probably the biggest change for them now is they have a new head coach who's a defensive mastermind in D'Amico Ryan. So if they're like they were last year, it's going to be a fun day for Rachaad, but they could be improved.
They might be different than they were. All right, and this is a fun piece of trivia you have here about this matchup. Tell us your fun fact about the Houston Texans matchup.
I'm not 100% sure how fun Bucs fans are going to find this one, but it is true that the Buccaneers have never won a regular season game in the city of Houston, and that dates back to the Oilers, of course. And the funny thing about that is the very first regular season game this franchise ever played was in Houston. So they've been trying since day one to get that win. They were 0-2 against Houston, against the Oilers in Houston, and 0-4 against the Oilers, and they're 0-2 in Houston against the Texans.
That'll be a great thing to keep in mind when that comes to that game. All right, next up we have Week 10, Tennessee Titans here at home versus the Bucs. Okay, so definitely this is one of those matchups where I'm hopeful that it's a Mike Evans day. It feels like maybe this could be a Mike Evans day.
Every day should be a Mike
That's
Evans
also
day.
very true. I think that Tampa should declare their Mike Evans day. But this matchup feels like one that could be a little favorable for him.
Well, it's a pretty interesting stretch here because we were just talking about the NFL's 32nd ranked run defense, and now the very next week they get to face the NFL's, well, at least from last year, 32nd ranked pass defense. Now, they have a lot of really young players back there. We've kind of had that theme with the young secondary the Buccaneers will be facing. In the last couple of years, they've drafted Roger McCreary, Christian Fulton, and Caleb Farley, and those guys all play big roles in their defense, but they're still developing players. So, even Chris Godwin, Mike Evans and Chris Godwin at this point are so experienced, have done so much in this league already, they're really going to have a big experience gap over those cornerbacks.
And I think the Titans have a running back that's kind of good.
Have you heard of him?
I think I've heard of him before. What are we feeling about the strategy against?
Look at that guy.
When we did joint practices with them, that was what we all talked about. Is we all wanted to walk next to him to see and it's like that's not a defensive end. Are we sure? Are we absolutely
You're talking about
sure?
Tractor Cito here. I love that nickname. I noticed that our producers here have managed to find a whole lot of clips of him being tackled pretty easily, and that doesn't always happen. You know. There you go. That's more like what you see a lot. So yeah, for some reason I thought that Derrick Henry had a bit of a down year last year. Couldn't be farther from the truth. He had 1,538 rushing yards and 15 TDs, and even had a career high 33 receptions. And yeah, we're getting to the part of the highlight reel now where he's breaking into the
doing the Derrick Henry thing.
That guy's just so big, and when he gets out in the open field, he's like a runaway train.
And then now, in terms of the other part of their offense, quarterback, they ended up with Will Levis. A little later than everybody thought, potentially. Still ended up with him. And what do you feel like it's going to be in terms of their quarterback situation? Again, another question of how long will he have been playing? Will he have been playing? What are your thoughts there?
It's funny. The quarterbacks were really the story of this year's draft, and 3 of them went in the first round, and then Will Levis here went. They traded up to get him very high in the second round, and then Hendon Hooker of Tennessee went in the third round. All 5 of those guys on the Bucs schedule this year. Now, I don't think Hendon Hooker's going to play, but Will Levis has a shot, and because this is the last year of Ryan Tannehill's contract, and they probably want to move on to Will Levis as soon as they can, and that could be this season. And since it's relatively late in the season, he might be in by then. And the thing about Levis, the reason he didn't go in the first round, which a lot of people thought he would, was his 2022 season wasn't quite as good as his 2021, but he's got all the tools. He's a big guy with a powerful arm, and I think they'll get him in there sooner rather than later.
All right, let's move on to Week 11 at San Fran. I am honestly tired of the Bucs playing them because I enjoy this team. I want to not have to root against them when they play against the Buccaneers because everybody loves John Lynch. And you had to love the Brock Purdy story. You just didn't love it against the Buccaneers. So tell me what you think this story could look like this year as he comes off the injury. Is Brock Purdy the guy? Is it not him? What do you think this team could look like when they obviously had a lot of great pieces around whoever their quarterback was?
It's pretty exciting story when you talk about the last guy picked in the draft, Mr. Irrelevant, becoming the key to them going as far as they did. His very first start, as you probably recall, was against the Buccaneers, and it didn't go well for the Buccaneers, and he had a very nice game. He actually came in for Jimmy Garoppolo the week before against Miami, and they won that game. So they won 8 straight games with him as their quarterback. And then they lost in the NFC Championship game, but he was hurt very early in that game, so you can't pin that one on him. So basically, they just never lose with him in the game. Obviously, that's not going to continue. They're not going to go 17-0 this year, but Is he going to come back and be that same magical thing, or is this just a kind of fun moment in time for that franchise? He is expected to start throwing again in a week or two, so if that's true and it goes well, he'll probably be ready for the season, and John Lynch has already said if he's ready, he's our guy.
And then we've talked about the offensive line being an interesting story for the Bucs this year, and especially now that we know Tristan Wirfs is being moved to left tackle, and this could be quite a test for him at that new spot in the line against a guy like Nick Bosa.
Nick Bosa is just an amazing player, and San Fran has always built from the line back on defense. They always try to load up as much talent there as they can, but the number one guy is your reigning defensive player of the year, Nick Bosa. He's got 34 sacks for the past 2 seasons, including, I think it was 18 and a half last year. So he pretty much gets you at least 1 sack every game.
That's crazy. And then I know that, as we talked about, the matchup last year did not go very well, particularly for the Bucs defense against the 49ers. Do you see that Bucs defense versus 49ers offense going a little bit differently this year?
Well, I think a lot of defenses are going to have a tough day against San Francisco, because not only is Kyle Shanahan a great play caller and architect of an offense, but they've got the most diverse and scary set of weapons in the league. They already were close to that, and then they traded for Christian McCaffrey. They've got Deebo Samuel. They've got Brandon Ayuk. They've got George Kittle. I mean, maybe it's not so surprising that Brock Purdy was so good. I mean, everybody he throws the ball to is a fantastic player, and they can move them all over the formation. So it's late in the season. The Bucs will have their defense figured out by then, and hopefully they can do a lot better than last time when they lost 35-7 and Christian McCaffrey had like 150 yards and 2 touchdowns.
Yeah, we don't need to talk about that. We don't need to remember that. It's a new year, new year. And so now let's move on to Week 12. The Bucs at the Indianapolis Colts, and man, this team is facing so many young or rookie quarterbacks potentially. It's going to be so interesting. So what do you feel like this game could look like when it comes to the quarterback they'd be facing, and especially we've talked about the need for more of an edge rush from the Buccaneer side to try to pressure especially a lot of these potentially young quarterbacks? I actually think Anthony Richardson has a better shot at being the starter for his team at this point in the season than Will Levis does, just because of the other options that they have there in Indy, which aren't great. And this is an exciting player you want to get on the field as soon as possible. A lot of people think he's very, very raw. He's not quite as raw as a lot of the detractors would say. I think they'll get him ready to play by then. And you talked about Joe Tryon-Shank and the guys, Shaq Barrett and all them, getting a pass rush off the edge. But in this case, against a guy like this, you also really have to think about containing off of the edge. So that's a big challenge for them. Yeah, and then how about Shaquille Leonard? I mean, this guy... Do you feel like this is the year that he could bring Indy to a new level potentially with what he's able to do? I think he's going to be very, very motivated to do so. I mean, this is a guy who stepped right into the league and was a star from day one. In his first 4 seasons, he went to 4 Pro Bowls and was a first-team All-Pro 3 times. And then last year he got hurt and only played in 3 games. And that was one of the big reasons Indy had a down season. Their defensive leader, their emotional leader, their best player on defense wasn't available for almost the entire season. So I think if he's fully healthy and back, it's going to make a big difference for them. The Bucs rushing game definitely had themselves a day against Indy last time. Do you think that it will be another chance for them to put up some crazy numbers, or has Indy fixed some of those leaks? Well, I mean, we talked about Shaquille Leonard. I keep wanting to say Darius Leonard because that's what he used to call himself. But whether or not they fixed it, this thing was a fluke for the Bucs. That's the difference. This game and all the running and the 4 rushing touchdowns, 3 there by Lenny, that wasn't how the season went the rest of the way. The Buccaneers did not run the ball well and did not score a lot of touchdowns on the ground. So this year, I believe they really want to be a lot more balanced, and so I think they will be trying to run the ball. So it could happen that way again. But again, Darius Leonard is in the middle there now for them again, and that's a big difference. I just learned earlier this week when looking at his Pro Football Reference page that his nickname is Maniac. Boy, so you can tell. Love to face people like that, self-proclaimed maniac. Yeah, you can figure out what style of play he probably has. That's pretty great. All right, let's move on to both Week 13 and Week 18 to talk about our 2 matchups against the Carolina Panthers. Again, I feel like a broken record. Young quarterbacks, rookie quarterbacks. Tell me what your thoughts are, especially knowing how late in the season it will be when they are facing the Panthers both times. What is that going to mean about who is quarterbacking their team? Bryce Young will be quarterbacking. I mean, barring injury, you always have to say Bryce Young will be quarterbacking that team, and he'll be quarterbacking that team in Week 1. I mentioned it earlier. You don't take a guy first of all in this day and age in the NFL and not put him in there in Week 1. And they have specifically said there's no timetable for him, but that doesn't matter. He's going to be starting Week 1, and he's a dynamic talent. I mean, the fact that he was drafted first overall, despite the fact that he was so out of the normal range in size for NFL quarterbacks, just shows you how talented he is in every other part of his game. Yeah, and what do you think that just in general, this matchup, what are some of the biggest things that you see in the head-to-head looking at these two teams, what these two games are going to look like?
Well, it's been a really good stretch for the Buccaneers in this last few years. They've won 7 of the last 9 games with Carolina, and their last 4 games, they've scored an average of 37.5 points. Their last 4 games in 20 and 21. Now, we remember we had the kind of rough game early on last year in Carolina, and then had the really big important win at the end of the season that clinched the division. So, but things are I think the gap is closing a little bit from what it was in 20 and 21 when the Bucs dominated. So this should be close, and those 2 games towards the end of the season could really be important for both teams.
Yes, they could. And then definitely feels like one of those games that could be a trenches battle. How do you see that looking, especially with the Bucs O-line and their D-line?
I call it like a down and dirty battle down there because you got Derek Brown leading that defense interior. He's a great player for the Panthers. They added Shy Tuttle, but those guys are going to be going against some guys that consider themselves maulers. Ryan Jensen starts the whole thing, and he's already said Matt Filer, who may be the starting left guard, is like that. And then he finds out about Cody Mauk, who has a chance to be the starting right guard, and found out that he's very much in the same vein. So you're going to have 3 guys in the middle that really like to rough it up.
Yeah, that's going to be fun to watch. All right, now let's go on to Week 15. Oh boy, December in Green Bay. Isn't that everybody's favorite thing?
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, you don't have to be the one out there playing in the snow.
That's
you know,
true.
I feel like the team might feel differently. Of course, I know they'd all say, we'll play them anytime, anywhere, rain, snow, whatever. But let's be real. You know, Green Bay in December could be a bit of a shock to the system to the Florida people down here.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I feel like this is going to be so interesting. It's Green Bay's looked one way for a lot of times here at quarterback, and now we know that is not the case. So what do you feel like that's going to look like for now both teams to be, instead of the Brady-Rodgers matchup, it's going to look a little different?
Yeah, for a few years here, especially in that NFC Championship game, the obvious story was 2 of the greatest of all time leading their teams against each other, and now both teams have moved on to new quarterbacks from them. So, you know, they are moving on to Jordan Love. The Buccaneers, it's either going to be Baker Mayfield or Kyle Trask, and there's no certainties for either team in that regard, although by this time in the season, both teams should know how well that's going and how the future looks for those guys. But I think they think pretty highly of Jordan Love and would have tried to keep Aaron Rodgers for a couple more seasons if they weren't ready to turn the reins over to him. And he doesn't have a ton of experience, but they put some new weapons around him. So I think it'll be interesting there. And of course, our quarterback battle is going to be very interesting.
Yes,
it'll be long decided by this point, but still.
Yes, and I mean, what do you see about not only Jordan Love, but just what you mentioned that they've put around him? What could that offense look like? Not just what he's doing, but everything around him.
Well, they famously never draft receivers in the first round, and everybody always assumed that's because Aaron Rodgers could make any group of pass catchers work. But interesting, this year they devoted their entire day to getting new pass catchers for Jordan Love. Last year they got Christian Watson and Romeo Doubs, and those were not first-round picks, but relatively high picks. And then this year in the 2nd and 3rd rounds they drafted one receiver named Jaden Reed, and then a pair of pretty good tight ends in Luke Musgrave and Tyler Kraft. So he's got a lot to work with. How soon can all that come together with all these young guys, including the quarterback? Who knows? But we are talking about mid-December, so they probably will have it pretty well rehearsed by that point.
And as we talked about December, do you feel like weather ends up being a factor? If you look at especially both of these teams, the offenses they like to run, how big of a factor could it potentially be?
You never know for sure, and I do remember, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years ago we went up to Green Bay and it was a December game and it was like 50 degrees, so you never know for sure. But I would be, if I were a betting man, I would say it's going to be very, very cold. It could be snowy. The NFC Championship game in late January, kickoff temperature was 29 degrees with 20-degree wind chill. That's pretty cold to me.
Yep, I mean, I feel like the Green Bay people are like, that's nothing.
Yeah,
and all of us, for me now, I'm basically below 60 and I'm cold. So.
Well, you're always going to have the guys on the visiting teams that want to prove their toughness by coming out with no sleeves on.
I always think that's very funny. Okay, so our final regular season matchup to discuss, because we already hit the last ones because of those division games, is Week 16 versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. I mean, man, the Florida teams just came in strong this last year. All of a sudden, you know, you had all 3 contending for important playoff spots. And do you feel like that could continue again this year? And how much could this matchup matter for how many Florida teams are getting in it?
Do you know how many times before last year that all 3 Florida teams were in the playoffs in the same year?
How many?
Only twice, and it was way back in 97 and 99. So this is a resurgent time for NFL football in Florida. By this point in the season, we're going to know what the trajectory is for these two teams. The Buccaneers are kind of hard to predict because of the change of quarterback, but the Jaguars seem to be on an upward trajectory, especially when they moved on to a new head coach in Doug Peterson last year, and Trevor Lawrence started to look like the superstar that he's supposed to be. So it's hard to say at this point, but they should be a pretty tough opponent.
Yeah, Trevor Lawrence definitely seemed like he was on the rise. Do you feel like he presents any particularly unique challenges for this Bucs defense at this point?
If you look back at it, Trevor Lawrence was considered the single best quarterback prospect to come into the league since Andrew Luck in 2012, and he had a rough rookie season, as a lot of rookie quarterbacks do, but something that had to do with the fact that it just didn't go very well with Coach Urban Meyer there, and you bring in Doug Peterson, you get a few new weapons like Christian Kirk, and voila, now you have Trevor Lawrence throwing for 4,113 yards and 25 touchdowns and only 8 interceptions when he threw 17 interceptions as a rookie. He was actually 7th in the MVP voting, which I did not realize until earlier today. So that's a guy clearly on the rise, and by the end of his 3rd season, I suspect you're going to see him considered among the league's elite by then.
And then looking at, whenever we do these schedule reaction shows and we talk about the schedule at large, we always base it on what happened last year and then obviously whatever changes have happened. And it never quite works out like we think it's going to based on the projections, but this was one of the teams that they didn't have the best pass defense last year. Do you see that being something that carries over? Is that something that the Bucs team will be able to exploit?
It's possible. They ranked 28th in pass defense last year, and they really didn't make a bunch of moves. They didn't sign any free agents like a lot of teams around the league, like both Atlanta and Carolina signed several defensive linemen to try to shore up their front. The Jaguars didn't do any of that. They didn't do much in the draft. They didn't take any up-front guys on defense until the 3rd day of the draft. So they're kind of running back with the same personnel, and it's the same coaching staff. So you're right. It doesn't stay the same from season to season, and this is so late in that season that by then what happened in 2022 isn't going to matter. But there is a chance that the Buccaneers and their great passing attack and all their great offensive players like Mike Evans and Chris Godwin and so on can have a big day that day.
And we know that the preseason games are not always the things that get the most fanfare when the schedule is released, but we do know what they are at this point. So we have home versus the Steelers, away at the Jets, and home versus the Ravens. We still do not have the times of those. Those come later, so make sure you stay tuned to Buccaneers.com to find out exactly when those are, especially if you're planning on a trip up there and to watch some of our coverage of it. I think those are going to be some fun matchups, especially Bowles going back to his Jets team and his son playing college up near there. I think that's going to be a lot of fun. But yeah, that is going to do it for us on this schedule reaction show presented by Ticketmaster. Thank you so much for hanging out with us. And again, we can't wait to see all of those matchups and how they play out.